G.R.R. Martin's saga, A Song of Ice and Fire, initially promised to absolutely transform our perception of the fantasy genre and leave behind a lasting cultural impact. To some extent, this has certainly been fulfilled, but definitely not in the originally intended way. Where the Magnum Opus was supposed to stand as a monument to a critique of human pettiness and fanaticism and greed and bloodthirstiness, it now stands as a sad memorial to the transience of time, the unfinished nature of things, and the pointlessness of all our efforts. Everything broken into atoms, while one weeps in silence, contemplating the cycle of human futility. In the upcoming show, I will dissect the failure of the Song of Ice and Fire in the fantasy genre, a genre that is fundamentally a modern continuation of mythology. And I will show that when one loses reverence for the mythological essence of human heroic stories, he then renders his own work unfinishable, as G.R.R. Martin sadly showed us. Welcome to Magne Mirare. Surely we all know of the triumphs and ultimate failure of the HBO's Game of Thrones. Despite its myriad flaws, the show rode the wave of hype for a considerable time, right up until the moment it exhausted its source material. At that juncture, it became evident that the producers were clueless about the philosophical concepts interwoven in the book's source. Yes, they understood that people enjoy dragons, daggers in the dark, and boobs. From a shallow perspective, it might seem that these very qualities propelled the show to its popularity. And don't get me wrong, they certainly didn't hurt. But what truly serves as the instinctively and universally perceived quality of any work of art, what truly shapes its essence, is the confidence of the work itself in its own ideals. Such a piece of art embodies a clear intellectual and philosophical certainty. The book's source and the TV series were at its root clear critique of war, violence, and human folly in the realms of ideology and fanaticism. HBO's Game of Thrones began to decline precisely the moment it started to glorify war, when it showed us beautifully choreographed duels, and when it pushed prophecies of saviors, originally meant as misleading in the source material, into the focal point of its interest. The failure of the literary source is a much more complex matter. George.R.R. Martin, an old-school hippie, likely hasn't forgotten his original principles. However, while writing short sci-fi stories, he armed himself with the deconstructive hammer of postmodernism so formidable that it renders building a long saga impossible. All hope for answers and underlying meaning were lost by the time of writing of the fourth book. And since then, the narrative has been nothing but smoke and mirrors, distraction for the audience and the author himself with excessive complexity. All that just to avoid the necessity of extracting any point it once maybe had. George.R.R. Martin is, as I mentioned, an old-school hippie. It's worth noting his proud decision to be conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. His work is liberal, pacifistic, and postmodern, something which is surprisingly not immediately evident to many. Martin began as a writer of short sci-fi stories, where not only his typical methods, but also the aforementioned attitudes and their themes become apparent. Criticism of war and human aggression, the futility of scheming, the confusion of ideological fanaticism, and occasionally, the dismantling of religious traditions as something insidious and constricting. Martin's characteristic story is one of false prophecies and visions, exploited by nefarious actors to drive humanity, prone to failure through belief in the supernatural, to self-destruction. All prophecies, mythologies, and religions in Martin's works are instruments of destruction. Our protagonists are tormented by conflicts. They are entangled in the tapestry of confusion and false visions. They struggle with their own needs for pride, responsibility, and search for identity. These protagonists are not heroes. They are not chosen ones, and are not enlightened beings. They are just people, entwined in the prison of human limitations, burdened by their essence and by the weight of the question, what they ought to fulfill in this world to be considered good or successful people. And through their tribulations and driven by various pains, they flail their hands around and harm other characters in the narrative. This approach is undoubtedly compelling, certainly enjoyable to read, and has its merits. However, when taken to its extreme form, and when combined with Martin's methods, it becomes a catastrophically flawed approach. The writing of this 30-year-long saga is not bad. As I said, it's very compelling. But Martin as an author is truly cursed with a dark synergy of several authorial traits, which eventually, cumulatively, become the design of the ruin of his own magnum opus. These traits are postmodern deconstruction, out-of-control complexity, and subversion of mythological essence. Deconstruction is a valuable tool only if it results in a meaningful analysis and understanding of the entire system. You have to be capable of sifting through the debris and extracting the diamond of pure knowledge from the layers of complexity. However, Martin wields his postmodern hammer with such a force that he not only sweeps away his characters and their stories, but also any value that might have been hidden within, ultimately scattering his own plotlines, ideas, typewriter, chair, and the house that surrounds him. Martin is a man who creates his work plagued by the dark essence of humanity. A person who interlaces his work with unmistakable pain from unfortunate love, shame from the feeling that rejection of bloodthirsty conflict is cowardice, disappointment that faith in deities and prophecies is futile because nothing will be resolved, and resentment towards what he presents as aggressive masculine world. Despite all these evidently deeply personal struggles, he seems unable to retain any ideal, like a lesson or a value worth passing on. It could be said that Martin philosophically burnt out long before he sat down to write Game of Thrones. But if the work lacks such a vision, it cannot have a point. It becomes merely an empty critique offering no alternative. Such a work can only be a depressing window into endless cycle of despair. Martin is a deeply cynical man. Of course, the work retains the subtext of Martin's proto-ideals. Very simplistically, war and violence are bad. But Martin's deconstruction is of such a strong character that it sweeps away in their entirety not only the bloodthirsty warmongers, but also the wise and peaceful rulers, and all indifferent bystanders. I get that such is the nature of war. As a picture of absolute collapse, this is great. Martin is writing, to a certain degree, Hamlet-like tragedy. But in Hamlet, virtue's and righteous path was always present in some way. Martin deconstructs hope itself. Eventually, the full system of human values and psychology is reduced to a rotting carcass at reader's feet. And after his grand destruction, he no longer has the strength to even point out that if war is bad, then peace is good. There are no answers, only suffering. Then, there is a constant subversion of expectations that Martin employs. No plan is ever fulfilled as stated. No character maintains their archetypal role, and ultimately, you as a reader are imprisoned in a realm of absolute uncertainty. You can't even be sure whether the protagonist will survive until the end of the chapter. Well, guess what? Martin is imprisoned with you in the same world. But you can put the book away. He can't. In his attempt to condemn the sins of humanity, Martin left no room for hope. Faith and tradition become misleading illusion of false salvation. Honor and wisdom become weaknesses, making one blind to daggers in the dark, and so forth. Personally, I, like many others, find this deeply cynical piece of art extremely entertaining. But it seems to be working much better in limited quantities and on small scale. For example, in a short sci-fi story for a science fiction magazine. Martin's cynicism sadly collides with the second pitfall of postmodernity, which is methodically deeply mishandled complexity. It's popular to divide authors into two sharply defined extremes. On one hand, an architect, an author meticulously planning every detail of his work. On the other, a gardener, an author allowing his work to blossom at its own pace, and in directions it itself deems fit. As is well known, Martin belongs to the latter type of author. Just to note, both positions are not necessarily the type of author, but rather methods an author employs. Neither should really be neglected by any artist. Anyway, Martin leans relatively strong towards the gardening method. There is a virtue of understanding one's work as something alive. It is an endeavor to liken oneself to God through act of small creation. It is the author's creative desire for the work to begin breathing with its own life and consciously gaze back at him. Martin achieves this in several ways. The most fundamental way he uses to achieve authenticity of his work is the use of the subjectivities of his characters. That is, the story is narrated from the point of view of several selected characters. This method not only provides their personal and imperfect perspective of the world, but also an intimate glimpse into their own souls. However, the combination of this very intimate method with Martin's desire for complexity eventually leads to an immensely chaotic situation. Look at this infographic. Side by side, you see all the chapters of the 5 published books and the released chapters from the unpublished 6th book. Each book is assigned a color, and each chapter, traditionally named after a POV character with a sequential number, is highlighted in the color of the book in which the character first appeared as a POV. For example, Davos Seaworth has his first chapter in the 2nd book and is henceforth given a red color. The problem is quite evident. For the sake of coherence, Martin's work might have been better suited for a trilogy format. In the first 3 books, the legacy characters are well maintained and the addition of new ones is very organic and meaningful. However, with the arrival of 4th book, a paradigm shift occurs. The author sets out to explore completely new and different plots, complicating the entire intricate situation of his fantasy universe. This is of course uncomfortable for readers, and the 4th book is quite controversial. Personally, I definitely don't think this is necessarily bad. In fact, I find such deliberate maneuver quite entertaining. Unfortunately, however, in the context of the entire work, it is just another nail in the coffin of its finishability. The atypicality of the 4th book is also evident in the relatively arbitrary series of characters suddenly stepping out of the original methodical chapter naming, and instead, their chapters now have their names derived from some specific role in which said character is currently present. These chapters are marked with a red dot, and note that I do not mark chapters where the change of character's name is justified and long-term, Sansa and her transformation into Elaine, and Theon's transformation into Reek. But those I did mark I view as a symptom. The symptom that the author is no longer satisfied with the original format of the work he decided to write years ago. Martin went off the road. In the 5th book, the last one published, the author tries to clean up the chaos caused by his excursion beyond the original theme of the saga. This one is still feasible, as the book mainly resonates with legacy characters from the 1st and 2nd part. However, Martin cannot seem to stop and again adds more characters and new plots. By the 6th book, the plots should start to unravel, but it seems impossible to satisfactorily conclude the stories of legacy characters from the first 3 books, and at the same time to resolve the entire huge new world of plots from the 4th and 5th books. You see, I've been heading to a point, which is that it's okay to be a gardener, if you know which parcel is your garden, where the pavement has already been laid, and in which climate zone you are. However, Martin is trying to be a gardener in the Amazon, and somewhere in the heart of the jungle, he lost the reason why he did it all in the first place. Do you know why Professor G.R.R. Tolkien did not get lost in the Silmarillion? Because he had clear mythological vision in which he believed. Tolkien famously decided to create a new mythology for the Anglo-Saxon world. Primarily a professor of history and linguistics, an educator who decided to gracefully transfer the wisdom of the past into a new age in the gentlest and most enlightened way possible. Tolkien's work is immensely extensive and complex. However, it does not crumble under its own weight for a simple reason. It stands on the indestructible foundations of ancient times. In the thousands of names, events, places, betrayals, and wars, you can always look around and see the mighty tower touching the heavens, thanks to which you always know where you are. I don't mean the towers of Barad-dûr or Thank, Minas Tirith, Minas Morgul, or the lamps of Iluin and Ormala. I mean the ubiquitous understanding that the world originates from the music of the Ainur, created by primordial, timeless deity Ilúvatar. The omnipresent understanding that light comes from the song of the universe, and that darkness is the cacophony of eternal struggle. This struggle is not in vain, as it is against darkness in the name of light. In contrast, A Song of Ice and Fire finds its origin in Robert Frost's 1923 poem Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. As you can see, Martin's initial inspirations are rooted in despair and the end of the world. Omnipresent fear that through our lust and hatred we will be torn asunder. I feel that. I feel that terrible pain and fear every day. Do not misunderstand me. I do not dismiss it. What I'm saying, however, is that Martin spent 30 years of his life on a monument of futility. No wonder that when you sit for decades only on the topic of absolute failure of human society, you burn out. And by not having any kind of answer to these pains, by lacking any love for hope, and without any solid foundation under his feet, Martin's work becomes mythologically empty and just plain depressing. Imagine being such an author. Your work is essentially a cry for help, a testament to your own despair and lack of faith. And you give it to the world, waiting to see what happens. And you know what happens? The world falls in love with it. Falls in love with the great dragons burning innocent people. Falls in love with the deviousness of the plotting daggers creeping through the darkness. And falls in love with the sweaty breasts of prostitute who will be shot by a siege crossbow in the next scene. In absolute shock over how your point was missed, you then get stuck. And you watch as the television adaptation falls apart. Through your own horror at the general misunderstanding of intimacy of your own pain. And through the incompetence of producers who are eager to do their Star Wars project. And through the poison of shallow, petty, secular consumer society calling for bread and circus. After all that, you have made meaningless fortune, and you have plenty time to kill. Maybe by commenting on the football season on your blog. Plenty of superficial mini-projects. And you are left with a crowd of disgruntled fans with no other sentence than, "Finish the book!" As I have already expressed, the book is undoable. Martin scattered heroes, villains, everything in between. He scattered war, peace, violence, and love. He scattered faith, tradition, and hope. The only thing left is a series of eclectic views into the painful world through the eyes of a bunch of characters whose name you don't even have to remember. They will all die. And why shouldn't they? After all, it never made any sense or had any point from the beginning. Not finishing this work is the most befitting ending it could have. It is a depressing jumble of cynical exclamations about the hopelessness of human endeavor. The crowds of fans, hoping for its completion, succumb to the same illusion of salvation as Martin's characters. Resolution will not come. Martin simply cannot achieve it. At the beginning I said that, unlike HBO's Game of Thrones, Martin probably hasn't forgotten his original principles. But I think that now, with them lying broken in his hands, he wishes he had.